With bruises hidden beneath carefully applied concealer and long sleeves in Seoul's humid summer heat, Keiko Williams counts every tip and every smile, knowing that each shift at the Meridian restaurant brings her closer to the $5,000 she needs to disappear. But when a powerful Korean mafia boss notices her flinch at the slightest touch, her carefully constructed plan to escape her abusive boyfriend begins to unravel in ways she never imagined. At 24, Keiko balanced serving trays with the weight of secrets she carried in her chest. She had moved to Seoul 18 months ago with dreams of teaching English and experiencing a new culture. Instead, she found herself trapped in a relationship with Marcus Chun, a volatile American expat who controlled every aspect of her life with threats and violence. The teaching job had disappeared when Marcus convinced her to quit, claiming he could support them both with his cryptocurrency trading. That support never materialized, leaving Keiko to work double shifts at one of Seoul's most upscale restaurants while Marcus spent her earnings on gambling and alcohol. The Meridian restaurant occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Gangnam, where Korea's elite conducted business over $100 plates and vintage wine. Keiko moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun, her warm brown skin glowing under the soft amber lighting. She had learned to smile through the exhaustion, to bow politely to customers who barely acknowledged her existence, to hide the finger-shaped bruises on her wrists beneath silk sleeves even when the kitchen temperatures soared. She kept a secret savings account that Marcus didn't know about, funded by cash tips she skimmed from her nightly earnings. $3,427. She needed $5,000 to buy a plane ticket back to Atlanta and have enough left over to start fresh. Each night, she counted the bills hidden beneath her mattress like a prayer, like a promise to herself that this nightmare would end. The man at table 12 had been coming to the Meridian for 3 months, always alone except for the occasional business associate who spoke in hushed, respectful tones. Kong Mi-ho was impossible to ignore. Late 30s, impeccably dressed in suits that cost more than Keiko made in 6 months, he had the kind of controlled presence that made conversation stop when he entered a room. His dark hair was swept back perfectly, his sharp features could have been carved from stone, and his eyes missed absolutely nothing that happened in his vicinity. Keiko had served him dozens of times, always coffee black, sometimes a single appetizer he barely touched. He tipped well, spoke politely in accented English, and never looked at her the way some of the other wealthy patrons did, like she was part of the decor they could purchase along with their meal. There was something different about Kong Mi-ho, something that made her nervous and curious in equal measure. What she didn't know was that Kong Mi-ho was the head of one of Seoul's most powerful crime families, that his legitimate real estate empire was built on a foundation of protection money, illegal gambling, and carefully orchestrated violence. She didn't know that his presence at the Meridian wasn't casual dining but calculated business, that the respectful associates who occasionally joined him were lieutenants reporting on territory disputes and revenue streams. What she also didn't know was that he had been watching her. It started 3 weeks into his regular visits when he noticed her covering a black eye with makeup that didn't quite match her skin tone. Then came the careful way she moved her left arm, favoring ribs that were obviously bruised. The long sleeves in summer heat. The way she flinched whenever anyone approached her from behind or moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. Kong Mi-ho had built his empire on reading people, on recognizing weakness and threat and opportunity in the smallest gestures. But what he saw in Keiko Williams wasn't weakness. It was strength barely holding together under pressure, dignity maintained despite circumstances designed to break it, and a light in her eyes that someone was systematically trying to extinguish. He had seen this before. He had failed to recognize it in time once before, and the memory of that failure haunted every decision he made. On a Thursday evening in late July, as Keiko moved between tables during the dinner rush, it happened. A middle-aged businessman at table 6, slightly drunk on expensive whiskey, reached out to pat her arm as she set down his order. The contact was casual, meaningless, the kind of thoughtless touch that happened hundreds of times in restaurants across the city. Keiko's reaction was immediate and visceral. She jerked away from the contact so violently that she nearly dropped the plate, her face draining of color as every muscle in her body tensed for violence that wasn't coming. The businessman, startled by her response, began to apologize, but Keiko was already backing away, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from conditioning rather than conscious thought. From table 12, Kong Miho watched the entire exchange with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. But he wasn't seeing Keiko as prey. He was seeing her as someone who had been hunted, someone who carried the invisible wounds of systematic abuse, someone who flinched at kindness because cruelty had become her normal. He knew that response. He had seen it in his sister's eyes 3 years too late. When Keiko approached his table 20 minutes later, her professional smile firmly back in place, but her hands still trembling slightly, Kong Miho made his move. "What can I get you tonight, Mr. Kong?" she asked, her voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline from the earlier incident. "Coffee, black," he replied, his dark eyes studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "In a moment of your time." Keiko's guard went up immediately. In her experience, when powerful men wanted her time, it rarely ended well. "I'm working," she said carefully, glancing toward the kitchen where her manager might be watching. "I noticed you were startled earlier," Kong Miho continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The man at table 6. He meant no harm." "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the same lie she had perfected over 18 months of hiding bruises and explaining away injuries. "Just clumsy." Kong Miho leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit catching the light as he moved. His presence was overwhelming, not threatening exactly, but powerful in a way that made the air feel thicker. "That's quite a bruise on your wrist," he said quietly. "You must be very clumsy." Keiko's free hand moved instinctively to pull down her sleeve, but it was too late. The silk had ridden up when she'd flinched away from the businessman, revealing the purpled fingerprints that circled her wrist like a bracelet of violence. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Kong Miho reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table between them. The card was simple, expensive, with his name embossed in gold and a phone number underneath. No company name, no title, just the tools to reach a man who could solve problems that normal people couldn't handle. "When you're ready to stop being clumsy," he said, his fingers pushing the card across the white tablecloth, "call me." "Why would you help me?" Keiko asked, her voice barely audible. "You don't even know me." Kong Miho's dark eyes held hers for a long moment, and in that stare she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not the calculating interest of a predator, but recognition. Understanding. The look of someone who had seen this kind of damage before and knew exactly what caused it. "Let's just say I have experience with men who hurt women," he said quietly, his accent making each word precise and deliberate. "And I have resources to make sure they stop permanently." The business card felt heavy in Keiko's pocket as she finished her shift, heavier than paper and ink should be. She knew she should throw it away, should pretend the conversation never happened. Getting involved with a man like Kong Miho, a man who radiated danger and spoke of permanent solutions with casual certainty, would be the definition of trading one problem for another. But as she walked home through Seoul's neon-lit streets, checking over her shoulder every few blocks out of habit, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her. Like she was a person worth protecting. Like her pain mattered to someone other than herself. She didn't know that Kong Miho was already making plans, already investigating the American man who had been systematically destroying the woman he'd been watching for 3 months. She didn't know that by accepting his card, she had unknowingly triggered the protective instincts of one of Seoul's most dangerous men. What she did know, as she climbed the stairs to the apartment she shared with Marcus, hearing his voice raised in anger at whatever game he was losing on his computer, was that she was tired of being afraid, tired of flinching, tired of counting tips and hiding bruises and pretending that $5,000 would be enough to save her from a man who had promised to find her no matter where she ran. The card was still in her pocket when Marcus grabbed her wrist and demanded to know why she was late. This time, when his fingers dug into the existing bruises and she bit back a cry of pain, she thought about dark eyes and expensive suits and a voice that spoke of permanent solutions. This time, she didn't throw the card away. 3 days after the business card found its way into Keiko's pocket, Marcus Chun discovered the secret savings account that represented her only hope of escape. The discovery came during one of his increasingly frequent searches through her belongings, a violation that had become routine whenever his cryptocurrency losses mounted and his paranoia peaked. The small bundle of bills hidden beneath her mattress might as well have been a signed confession of her planned betrayal. The bruises on Keiko's wrist had deepened into ugly purple and yellow patches that no amount of concealer could hide. Marcus had grabbed her harder than usual when she'd returned from her shift at the Meridian, suspicious about her late arrival and convinced she was hiding something from him. His fingers had found the exact spots where he'd gripped her before, pressing into the tender flesh with deliberate cruelty. She had been counting the money when he found her, sitting on the edge of their shared bed in the cramped apartment they rented in a building that had seen better decades. $3,427 in small bills, mostly 10s and 20s, the accumulated tips from months of double shifts and careful skimming. To Marcus, it represented opportunity. To Keiko, it represented freedom that was about to be stolen from her. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that always preceded violence. His pale complexion was flushed with anger and alcohol, his thin frame vibrating with the nervous energy of a man whose gambling debts had grown beyond his ability to manage. "Tips," Keiko replied carefully, her hands moving slowly to avoid triggering his temper. "From the restaurant. I've been saving for emergency expenses." "Emergency expenses," Marcus repeated, his laugh containing no humor. "Like running away. Like abandoning me after everything I've done for you." The accusation hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Keiko's mind raced through possible responses, each one carrying the risk of escalation. Marcus had never been physically imposing, but desperation had made him unpredictable, and the combination of financial pressure and substance abuse had eroded whatever self-control he'd once possessed. "I would never leave you," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "The money is just security, in case something happens." "Something is about to happen," Marcus said, snatching the bills from her hands with violent efficiency. "I owe some people money. Important people. And you're going to help me pay them back." The cold certainty in his voice made Keiko's stomach drop. She had heard rumors about Marcus's gambling, whispered conversations on phone calls he thought she couldn't overhear, but she hadn't understood the scope of his debts or the kind of people who were expecting payment. Now, seeing the desperate calculation in his eyes as he counted her carefully saved bills, she realized that her escape fund had just become his lifeline. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He disappeared for hours without explanation, returning with bloodshot eyes and the kind of nervous energy that comes from stimulant abuse. He made phone calls in rapid Korean that Keiko couldn't understand, his voice alternating between pleading and threatening. Most disturbing of all, he began looking at her differently, like she was a commodity he was evaluating for market value. The breaking point came on Saturday evening when Keiko returned from her shift to find Marcus entertaining 3 men in their living room. The visitors were Korean, well dressed in an expensive but understated way, and they carried themselves with the confident stillness of people accustomed to being feared. Their presence filled the small apartment like smoke, making the air feel thicker and more dangerous. Marcus introduced them as business associates, but Keiko recognized predators when she saw them. Their eyes tracked her movement as she tried to escape to the bedroom, evaluating her with the cold assessment of livestock appraisers. She had encountered this kind of attention before, in the darker corners of the hospitality industry, where women disappeared into trafficking networks and were never seen again. "We need to talk privately," one of the men said to Marcus, his English heavily accented but precise. "About our arrangement." Keiko retreated to the bedroom, but the thin walls of their apartment meant privacy was an illusion. Through the door, she could hear fragments of conversation that made her blood turn cold. Debt amounts in the tens of thousands. Interest rates that compounded weekly. Payment alternatives that involved her specifically. "She's worth at least 15,000 on the Busan market," one voice said with casual certainty. "More if she's clean and compliant." "That's not enough to cover what I owe," Marcus replied, his voice tight with fear and calculation. "Then you'll need to provide additional services," came the response. "She can work off the difference in the entertainment district. 6 months, maybe 8. The conversation continued, but Keiko had stopped listening. Her hands were shaking as the full scope of Marcus's plan became clear. He wasn't just taking her money. He was selling her, trading her body to cover his gambling debts, condemning her to a life of sexual slavery in the criminal underworld that fed Korea's sex trafficking industry. She thought about the business card hidden in her jewelry box, the one she'd carried for 3 days without finding the courage to use. Kang Mi-ho had said he had experience with men who hurt women, that he had resources to make them stop permanently. At the time, his offer had seemed too dangerous to consider. Now, listening to strangers discuss her market value like she was livestock, danger had become relative. The men left after an hour, but their presence lingered in the apartment like the smell of cigarette smoke. Marcus was agitated, pacing the living room and drinking directly from a bottle of soju while muttering in English and Korean. When Keiko emerged from the bedroom, he grabbed her arm with enough force to leave new bruises. "Pack a bag," he said, his grip tightening when she tried to pull away. "We're leaving in the morning." "Where are we going?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "To settle my debts," Marcus replied. "Don't worry. The people I owe are very understanding about alternative payment methods." That night, while Marcus passed out drunk on their couch, Keiko sat in their bathroom with the door locked and Kang Mi-ho's business card in her trembling hands. The number seemed to blur through her tears as she realized that her choice had been reduced to 2 options: call a dangerous stranger for help, or disappear into souls trafficking networks and never be seen again. She had never been more terrified in her life, but she had also never been more certain that she was out of alternatives. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, crisp and alert despite the late hour. "This is Kang Mi-ho." The sound of his name, spoken in his own precise accent, nearly made her hang up. But then she heard Marcus shifting on the couch, muttering threats in his sleep, and she found her voice. "This is Keiko Williams," she whispered. "From the restaurant. You gave me your card." "I remember," he said immediately. "Where are you?" The question was sharp, urgent, like he had been expecting this call. "My apartment," she replied. "But I think I'm in trouble." "Big trouble." "Are you safe right now?" he asked. "For now. But in the morning." "Give me your address," Kang Mi-ho said, and something in his tone made her believe that help was actually possible. After she provided the information, there was a brief silence before he spoke again. "Pack whatever you need quickly and quietly," he said. "I'm 15 minutes away. When I arrive, you're going to walk out of that apartment and never go back. Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered. "Good," Kang Mi-ho said. "And Keiko?" "Yes. You're going to be safe. I promise you that." The line went dead, leaving Keiko alone in the bathroom with a decision that would change everything. Outside, Seoul continued its neon buzz of nighttime activity, oblivious to the fact that one of its most powerful crime bosses was about to declare war on behalf of a waitress he barely knew. Keiko packed her few valuables into a backpack, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. She left most of her clothes, taking only the essentials and the small amount of money Marcus hadn't discovered. As she prepared to leave the only home she'd known in Seoul, even if it had been a prison, she wondered if she was trading one form of captivity for another. But when she heard the soft knock on the apartment door exactly 15 minutes later, and saw Kang Mi-ho standing in the hallway dressed in dark clothing that made him look more dangerous than any suit ever could, she realized that some forms of captivity were voluntary, and some were salvation. Marcus never woke up as she walked out of their apartment for the last time. Kang Mi-ho's protective presence at her back like a shield against everything that had tried to destroy her. By morning, Marcus Chun and his debt problems would be permanently resolved, and Keiko Williams would begin to understand exactly what kind of man she had called for help. The private office of Kang Mi-ho occupied the top floor of one of Seoul's most prestigious commercial towers, a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city sprawling below, while custom leather furniture and dark mahogany surfaces created an atmosphere of wealth and unquestionable authority. When Keiko stepped into this sanctuary of power 24 hours after her rescue from Marcus, she felt like an intruder in a world she had no business entering. She had spent the previous night in a safe house that Mi-ho's organization maintained for exactly these situations, a sterile but comfortable apartment where women could recover from whatever circumstances had brought them under his protection. A doctor had examined her injuries, a woman had brought her clean clothes in exactly her size, and security personnel had assured her that Marcus Chun was no longer a concern for anyone. She hadn't asked what that meant. Some questions were better left unanswered. Now, standing in Miho's office wearing a simple but expensive dress that someone had selected for her, Keiko felt the full weight of her situation settling around her like gravity. She was safe, protected, clean, and fed. But she was also completely dependent on a man whose business card had identified him only by name and phone number, whose resources seemed unlimited, and whose methods for solving problems remained deliberately mysterious. Kong Miho sat behind his desk reviewing documents with the focused attention of someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars. His suit today was charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, with a silk tie that probably cost more than Keiko's monthly salary at the Meridian. He looked up when she entered, his dark eyes studying her with the same intensity she remembered from the restaurant. But now she understood that this attention came from a man who controlled significant portions of Seoul's legitimate and illegitimate economy. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. "We have business to discuss." The formality in his voice made it clear that whatever arrangement had gotten her safely through the night was temporary. This meeting would determine the terms of whatever came next, and Keiko suspected that her input would be limited to acceptance or refusal of whatever Kong Miho had already decided. "You saved my life," she began, unsure of the proper protocol for thanking a crime boss. "I don't know how to repay that kind of debt." Miho leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe me a debt, Miss Williams. You called for help, and I provided it. What we're discussing now is a business proposition that benefits both of us." The word business sent a chill through Keiko's chest. In her experience, when men like Marcus talked about business involving her, it usually meant something that left her feeling violated and powerless. But Kong Miho's tone was different, formal and respectful, like he was about to present a contract rather than issue a demand. "I'm going to be very clear about what I'm offering," Miho continued, opening a leather folder and withdrawing several documents. $100,000 per year, paid monthly. A secure apartment in a building I own, fully furnished and maintained. Complete personal protection provided by trained security personnel. All medical expenses covered, including any therapy you might require to process your recent experiences. Keiko's mind struggled to process numbers that large. $100,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having access to. Enough to live comfortably for years without worrying about rent or food or basic necessities. It was also an amount that suggested this arrangement involved more than simple charity. "In exchange," Miho said, his voice taking on the precision of someone accustomed to negotiating high-stakes agreements, "you would provide certain services. You would accompany me to business functions that require the presence of an educated, articulate companion. You would provide English tutoring for the children of my associates, helping them prepare for international schools. You would maintain absolute silence about any business matters you might observe or overhear." The terms were more reasonable than Keiko had expected, almost disappointingly normal. Companion duties and tutoring were legitimate work, the kind of arrangements that wealthy men made with educated women all the time. But the emphasis on silence suggested that she would be witnessing activities that normal tutors and companions never encountered. "What kind of business functions?" she asked carefully. "Dinners with investors," Miho replied. "Cultural events where international connections are important. Occasionally, meetings where your presence would demonstrate that my organization values education and refinement." The word organization hung in the air between them, a polite euphemism that acknowledged what they both understood without explicitly naming it. Kong Miho ran a criminal empire, and she would be expected to smile politely while money laundering and territorial agreements were discussed over expensive wine. "And if I refuse," she said, testing the boundaries of her situation. "Then you're free to leave," Miho answered immediately. "I'll provide you with enough money to return to America and start fresh. No obligations, no expectations. You simply walk away and never see me again." The offer sounded too good to be true, which made Keiko suspicious of the alternative. "But what about Marcus?" she asked. "And the people he owed money to?" Miho's expression darkened slightly, the first emotion he'd shown since she'd entered his office. Marcus Chun is no longer capable of harming anyone, he said quietly. His debts have been settled permanently, and the organization he was dealing with understands that you are under my protection. They will not bother you again. The finality in his voice made it clear that Marcus's fate had been decided with the same efficiency that characterized everything else in Kong Miho's world. She should have felt horror at the implication, should have been disturbed by her proximity to violence. But all she felt was relief. For the first time in 18 months, she didn't have to be afraid of going home. But accepting Miho's offer meant acknowledging that she was trading one form of dependence for another, exchanging Marcus's violent control for Kong Miho's wealthy protection. The cage might be gilded, but it was still a cage, and she would still be dependent on a man's whims for her safety and survival. You're asking me to become part of your world, she said, trying to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. I'm asking you to accept my protection in exchange for services that utilize your education and intelligence, Miho corrected. You would not be involved in any illegal activities. You would not be asked to do anything that compromises your safety or dignity. You would simply be a respected member of my household, compensated generously for legitimate work. The distinction sounded reasonable, but Keiko had learned to be suspicious of reasonable-sounding offers from powerful men. What happens if I want to leave later? She asked. If I change my mind about this arrangement. Then you leave, Miho said simply. With a generous settlement and my continued protection for as long as you require it. I don't keep unwilling people in my employ, Miss Williams. Loyalty earned through gratitude and respect is far more valuable than compliance enforced through fear. His answer surprised her with its directness, but it also raised questions about what kind of gratitude and respect he expected to earn. Wealthy men didn't typically offer $100,000 salaries to women they barely knew unless they anticipated receiving more than tutoring and companion services in return. Keiko looked around the office, taking in the expensive artwork and custom furniture, the view of a city where she had been struggling to survive just days earlier. Kong Miho was offering her financial security, physical safety, and protection from threats she couldn't handle alone. In exchange, he wanted her company at business functions and her skills as an English tutor, along with her silence about whatever crime she might witness. The moral calculus was complicated. Accepting his offer meant benefiting from criminal activity, becoming complicit in whatever violence and illegal enterprise funded his empire. But refusing meant returning to a world where men like Marcus could destroy her with impunity, where her safety depended on hiding and hoping rather than protection and power. She thought about the bruises that were still healing on her wrists, about the fear that had become so constant she'd stopped noticing it, about the $3,000 that Marcus had stolen along with her dreams of escape. She thought about the men who had discussed selling her like livestock, and about the alternative future that Kong Miho was offering with calm professionalism. Maybe morality was a luxury she couldn't afford. I need time to consider this, she said finally. Of course, Miho replied, closing the leather folder with practiced efficiency. You have 24 hours to make your decision. During that time, you'll remain in the safe house with full protection. Whatever you decide, you'll be safe. He stood from his desk, his movement controlled and graceful, and extended his hand toward her. This was clearly a dismissal, but it felt more like the conclusion of a business meeting than the end of a negotiation for her future. As Keiko shook his hand, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip, she realized that she had already made her decision. The 24 hours he was offering weren't really for consideration. They were for her to come to terms with a choice that circumstances had already made for her. Walking out of Kong Miho's office, she understood that tomorrow she would return to accept his proposition, not because she particularly wanted to become part of a criminal organization, but because the alternative was a world where women like her had no protection against men like Marcus. Sometimes survival meant choosing the lesser evil. Sometimes it meant accepting that safety came with a price, and that price might be her innocence, but not necessarily her integrity. Tomorrow, she would call Kong Miho and accept his offer. Tonight, she would mourn the idealistic young woman who had believed that good intentions and hard work were enough to keep her safe in a world designed to destroy women who had no powerful protectors. By accepting his proposition, she wouldn't just be choosing financial security. She would be choosing to live in a world where protection came from embracing darkness rather than fighting it. 6 weeks after accepting Kong Miho's proposition, Keiko Williams had grown accustomed to waking up in a world where safety was a given rather than a luxury. Her apartment occupied the 15th floor of one of Seoul's most exclusive residential towers, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Han River and furnishings that cost more than most people earned in years. The morning routine that had once involved checking locks and planning escape routes now included ordering coffee from the building's concierge service and reviewing her schedule for tutoring sessions with the children of Miho's associates. The transformation in her daily life was so complete that sometimes she struggled to remember the woman who had counted tips in a cramped apartment shared with a man who saw her as property. That woman had flinched at unexpected sounds and covered bruises with carefully applied makeup. This woman wore silk blouses that cost more than her former monthly rent and moved through spaces designed to accommodate wealth and power as though she belonged there. The apartment itself was a study in understated luxury, decorated in neutral tones with carefully selected artwork that suggested sophisticated taste without ostentation. Everything had been chosen to reflect the preferences of an educated woman with refined sensibilities, from the library filled with contemporary literature to the state-of-the-art kitchen that Keiko had learned to use for preparing meals that bore no resemblance to the convenience store dinners of her previous life. What surprised her most was how quickly she had adapted to the routines of her new existence. 3 mornings a week, she provided English tutoring to the teenage children of Miho's business associates, helping them prepare for entrance examinations to international schools. The work was legitimate and rewarding, utilizing her teaching background in ways that felt meaningful rather than exploitative. Her students were bright and motivated, children of families wealthy enough to afford private tutoring, but pragmatic enough to understand that English fluency would determine their access to global opportunities. Keiko found herself genuinely invested in their progress, proud when they mastered difficult concepts and protective of their confidence when they struggled with pronunciation or grammar. The other 2 days of her work week involved accompanying Kong Miho to business functions where her presence served multiple purposes. She provided translation services when international investors required precise communication about complex financial arrangements. She engaged in social conversation with the wives and daughters of business partners, demonstrating that Miho's organization valued education and cultural refinement. Most importantly, she served as evidence that he was sophisticated enough to attract and retain the loyalty of an intelligent, independent woman. These events ranged from intimate dinners in private dining rooms to elaborate parties in luxury hotels where Seoul's elite gathered to network and negotiate deals that shaped the city's economic landscape. Keiko learned to navigate conversations about art and literature while seated next to men who controlled shipping routes and construction contracts. She mastered the art of appearing interested in discussions of real estate development while understanding that the properties being discussed served purposes beyond legitimate commerce. What fascinated her was how effectively Miho moved between his legitimate business interests and the criminal enterprises that funded his empire. He spoke with equal authority about urban planning initiatives and territorial agreements, shifting between the language of corporate leadership and organized crime with the fluency of someone who saw no meaningful distinction between the two worlds. During their 3rd week of working together, Keiko began to understand that Kong Miho's criminal organization was evolving into something more sophisticated than traditional mafia operations. He was investing in technology companies and luxury developments, buying legitimacy with profits from illegal activities, creating an empire that could eventually function without the violence and criminality that had built it. The realization came during a dinner meeting with Japanese investors who were interested in partnering on a high-rise development project in Gangnam. Keiko listened to Miho present detailed financial projections and architectural plans with the expertise of someone who had studied urban development rather than inherited a crime family. When the investors asked technical questions about construction permits and environmental impact assessments, he answered with specificity that suggested genuine knowledge rather than rehearsed responses. After the meeting, as they rode back to her apartment building in his armored sedan, Keiko found herself curious about the man who had rescued her from Marcus and offered her a new life. "You studied business, didn't you?" she said. breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them during the drive. Miho glanced at her with mild surprise, as though her question had interrupted a line of thought he'd been pursuing. At Seoul National University, he replied, MBA with a focus on international finance. My father believed that modern criminal organizations needed legitimate business expertise to survive. The casual way he mentioned his criminal inheritance struck Keiko as significant. He spoke about inheriting a crime family the way other men might discuss taking over the family restaurant, with a mixture of duty and pragmatism that suggested he'd never had the luxury of choosing a different path. Do you enjoy it? She asked. The legitimate business side, I mean. More than I expected, Miho admitted, his voice carrying a note of surprise at his own honesty. Building something that can last beyond violence and fear. Creating value instead of just extracting it from other people's work. The conversation revealed aspects of his personality that the business meetings hadn't shown. Beneath the controlled exterior and calculated authority, Kong Miho was a man who took genuine pride in his achievements, who found satisfaction in solving complex problems and building enterprises that would outlast him. Over the following weeks, these glimpses of the person behind the crime boss became more frequent. Keiko learned that he had an extensive collection of contemporary Korean art, that he read voraciously about economic theory and urban planning, that he spoke 4 languages fluently and was working on a 5th. She discovered that he remembered details about her preferences with startling accuracy, appearing with her favorite Ethiopian coffee when she mentioned missing the flavors from a restaurant in Atlanta, arranging private museum tours when she expressed interest in traditional Korean ceramics. The thoughtfulness behind these gestures suggested an attention to her comfort and happiness that went beyond the requirements of their business arrangement. Miho was treating her not just as an employee or a protected asset, but as someone whose opinions mattered to him, whose contentment contributed to his own well-being in ways that seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. The shift in their dynamic became most apparent during the quiet moments between formal events. Keiko found herself asking about his day, genuinely interested in the challenges he faced managing an organization that operated simultaneously in legal and illegal spheres. Miho began seeking her perspective on business decisions, particularly those involving international partnerships where her American background provided useful insights. These conversations often took place in his office after business dinners, when the formal requirements of their arrangement had been fulfilled, but neither seemed eager to end the evening. Keiko would curl up in one of his leather chairs, shoes off and silk dress replaced by comfortable clothes, while Miho reviewed documents and occasionally shared observations about the people they'd encountered or the deals they'd witnessed. It was during one of these late evening conversations that Keiko realized she had stopped flinching when he entered a room. The hypervigilance that had characterized her responses to masculine presence for 18 months had gradually faded, replaced by a sense of anticipation when she heard his voice or saw his familiar silhouette in doorways. The change was so gradual that she didn't notice it happening until she found herself looking forward to his arrival rather than bracing for potential threat. When Miho walked into her apartment unannounced to discuss schedule changes or provide updates about security concerns, her body relaxed rather than tensed. Her breathing deepened rather than shortened. More significantly, she had begun to enjoy his physical presence in ways that had nothing to do with the protection he provided. The expensive cologne he wore, something woodsy and sophisticated that lingered in rooms after he left. The controlled grace of his movements. The way he could navigate a crowded restaurant or command attention in a boardroom with equal efficiency. The rare moments when his professional composure slipped slightly, revealing glimpses of the man who existed beneath the crime boss facade. One evening in late September, after a particularly successful business dinner where Keiko had helped Miho secure a partnership with a European shipping company, she found herself studying his profile as he drove through Seoul's neon-lit streets. His sharp features were softened by the city lights filtering through the sedan's windows, and she noticed details that had escaped her attention during more formal interactions. The slight scar near his left temple that suggested a violent past. The elegant shape of his hands on the steering wheel. Fingers that could sign multi-million-dollar contracts or order someone's death with equal ease. When he caught her looking, their eyes met in the rearview mirror for a moment that lasted several heartbeats too long. The air in the car seemed to thicken with awareness, acknowledgement of an attraction that had been building quietly beneath their professional relationship for weeks. Neither of them spoke about what passed between them in that moment, but the silence that followed was charged with possibility rather than discomfort. Keiko understood that she was falling for the man who had saved her life, and that he was allowing her to see aspects of himself that he kept hidden from the rest of his world. By the time they reached her building, she had acknowledged to herself that what had begun as gratitude for his protection had evolved into something far more complicated and dangerous than she had anticipated when she'd accepted his proposition. Kong Miho had offered her safety and financial security. What he was giving her was the possibility of love with a man whose world operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. The first sign that Keiko's carefully constructed new life was about to be shattered came in the form of a dead pigeon left outside her apartment door. She discovered the bird on a Tuesday morning in early October, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, positioned deliberately on her doormat like a calling card. Building security claimed to have no record of unauthorized access, but the message was clear enough that even someone unfamiliar with criminal intimidation tactics could understand its meaning. Someone knew where she lived, despite the layers of protection that Kong Miho's organization had constructed around her new identity. The second warning arrived 3 days later when her favorite coffee shop, a small establishment near Seoul National University where she sometimes met with her tutoring students, was vandalized overnight. Windows smashed, furniture destroyed, and a message spray painted across the wall in crude Korean that the owner refused to translate, but whose meaning was obvious from his terrified expression when he saw Keiko approaching. By the time the third incident occurred, a suspicious fire in a restaurant where she had dined with Miho the previous week, the pattern had become unmistakable. Someone was systematically targeting locations associated with her routine, sending a message that nowhere in Seoul was beyond their reach. Miho's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the restaurant fire being reported, Keiko's apartment was surrounded by additional security personnel who positioned themselves at every entrance and exit point. Her movements were restricted to essential activities only, with armed escorts accompanying her to tutoring sessions and business functions. The freedom that had defined her new life disappeared overnight, replaced by a level of protection that felt more like house arrest. The explanation for these escalating threats came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chun, who Keiko had been assured was no longer capable of harming anyone, had not only survived Miho's intervention, but had spent the past 2 months building an alliance with one of Seoul's rival criminal organizations. His gambling debts had been absorbed by the Huang family, a group that controlled territories in Busan and had been seeking opportunities to challenge Kong Miho's dominance in Seoul's more lucrative markets. Marcus had offered the Huang organization something valuable: detailed information about Miho's personal life, including the identity and daily routines of the woman who had become his most visible vulnerability. The dead pigeon and vandalized coffee shop were reconnaissance missions, probing the extent of Keiko's protection while gathering intelligence about response times and security procedures. The actual attack came on a Thursday evening when Keiko was returning from a late tutoring session with the teenage daughter of one of Miho's business partners. Her usual security escort had been delayed by traffic, leaving her alone in the building's parking garage for less than 3 minutes. In organized crime, 3 minutes was an eternity. The assault team consisted of 5 men armed with tasers and restraints, professionals who had clearly studied the building's layout and security protocols. They moved with military precision, disabling cameras and avoiding the patrol routes that Miho's people had established. If not for a malfunctioning elevator that forced Keiko to take the stairs, giving her an extra 30 seconds to notice something wrong in the parking garage's atmosphere, the kidnapping would have succeeded. Instead, she managed to trigger the silent alarm on the panic device that Miho had insisted she carry, a small electronic beacon that looked like a luxury watch but could summon his entire organization with the press of a hidden button. Even as hands grabbed her from behind and electricity coursed through her body from the taser, Keiko held onto the knowledge that help was coming. The rescue operation that followed was swift and overwhelmingly violent. Miho's response team reached the parking garage within 4 minutes of the alarm activation, But by then the kidnappers had already loaded the unconscious Keiko into a van and were attempting to leave the building. What ensued was a running gunfight through Seoul's early evening traffic that left 2 vehicles destroyed and multiple casualties among the Hwang family soldiers. Keiko regained consciousness in a private medical facility that Miho's organization maintained for situations requiring discreet treatment. Her body ached from the electrical shock and physical restraint, but she was alive and surrounded by the controlled efficiency of people whose job was keeping her safe. The relief of survival was quickly overshadowed by the realization of how close she had come to disappearing permanently. Miho arrived at the medical facility within an hour, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled rage. His expensive suit was rumpled, his dark hair disheveled, and there was a quality in his eyes that Keiko had never seen before, something cold and predatory that reminded her that beneath his civilized exterior was a man capable of extraordinary violence. When he saw her conscious and alert, the transformation was immediate. The cold fury softened into relief, and for a moment he looked like a man who had almost lost something irreplaceable rather than a crime boss whose authority had been challenged. "You're safe," he said, his voice carrying emotion that his professional mask usually concealed. "They will never threaten you again." The promise in his words was absolute, spoken with the certainty of someone who had already decided the fate of everyone involved in the kidnapping attempt. Keiko understood that Marcus and his allies had made a fatal mistake by targeting her, not because she was valuable as leverage, but because harming her had awakened something in Kang Miho that even his enemies had underestimated. Over the next several hours, as medical staff monitored her condition and security personnel debriefed the rescue operation, Keiko learned the scope of Miho's retaliation. The Hwang family's Seoul operations were being systematically dismantled, their key personnel arrested or disappeared, their financial assets frozen through corrupted banking channels. Marcus Chun and the men who had attempted her kidnapping were being hunted with resources that included corrupt police officials and international criminal contacts. But it was during the quiet conversation that took place after midnight, when the immediate crisis had been contained and they were alone in her hospital room, that Keiko finally understood what drove Miho's protective instincts. "I had a sister," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this story was rarely shared. "Younger than me by 8 years. Beautiful, intelligent, everything good about our family concentrated in one person." He paused, looking out the window at Seoul's skyline as though the lights of the city could provide answers to questions that had haunted him for years. "She met a man when she was 22, Miho continued. "A businessman," he claimed. "Charming, educated, from a good family. Our parents approved of him. I was too busy building this empire to pay attention to the details of her relationship." Keiko could see where this story was leading, could recognize the pattern of abuse and escalation that she had survived, but that not all women escaped. "The abuse started small," Miho said, his controlled voice not quite hiding the pain underneath. "Emotional manipulation, financial control, isolation from family and friends. By the time we realized what was happening, she was completely under his power. When she finally tried to leave him, he killed her. Made it look like suicide, but we knew the truth." The raw honesty in his confession made Keiko's chest tighten with sympathy. She understood now why he had recognized the signs of abuse so quickly, why her flinching response had triggered such immediate intervention, why protecting her had become a mission that went beyond simple business arrangement. "I built all of this," Miho said, gesturing toward the medical facility and the security apparatus that surrounded them, "to ensure that no one could ever hurt what belongs to me again. But power without purpose is hollow. Until you called me that night, I had forgotten why any of it mattered." His admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable in a way that transformed him from crime boss to man, from protector to someone who needed protection himself, from the one offering salvation to someone seeking it. Keiko reached out, her fingers finding his hand where it rested on the medical bed's railing. The contact was electric, charged with weeks of growing attraction and the shared intensity of surviving a threat that could have destroyed everything they were building together. "You saved me," she said softly. "But maybe I saved you too." When Miho looked at her, his dark eyes reflected something that had nothing to do with business arrangements or criminal enterprises. What she saw was love, complicated and dangerous and absolutely certain. The kind of emotion that made powerful men restructure their entire world around one person's safety and happiness. "You're mine," he said quietly, leaning closer until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "Not because I own you, but because you chose to be." "I'm yours," Keiko agreed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were acknowledging. "And you're mine, broken pieces and all." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who had almost lost everything that mattered. The kiss tasted like relief and promise, and the beginning of something that would reshape both their worlds in ways they were only beginning to understand. Outside, Seoul continued its restless pulse of commerce and crime. But inside the medical facility's protected walls, two people who had found salvation in each other's arms finally stopped pretending that their arrangement was purely business. By morning, Marcus Chun and the remnants of his alliance would be permanently eliminated. The Huang family's challenge to Miho's authority would be decisively answered. And Keiko Williams would wake up knowing that she had not just survived an attempt on her life, but had discovered a love worth protecting with the full power of Seoul's most dangerous criminal organization. 3 months after the night that had nearly cost Keiko her life, Seoul's criminal underworld operated under a new understanding. Kang Miho's woman was untouchable, and the consequences for forgetting this lesson were permanent and absolute. The elimination of Marcus Chun and the complete destruction of the Huang family's operations had sent ripples through every level of organized crime in South Korea, establishing a precedent that would be remembered for generations. Keiko stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Miho's penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath them like a kingdom that acknowledged their authority. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, no longer the frightened waitress who had counted tips and hidden bruises, but someone who moved through Seoul's most exclusive circles with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The engagement ring on her finger caught the morning light, a flawless diamond surrounded by smaller stones that had been specially cut and set by one of Europe's most exclusive jewelers. The ring was worth more than most people earned in decades, but its value lay not in the stones themselves, but in what it represented. Kang Miho's public declaration that Keiko Williams was not just under his protection, but was destined to become the official matriarch of one of Asia's most powerful criminal dynasties. The proposal had come 6 weeks earlier, during a private dinner in the penthouse that had been intended as a quiet celebration of the successful merger between Miho's organization and a legitimate technology company. The business victory had been significant, representing another step in his long-term plan to transform his inherited criminal empire into something that could operate openly in legitimate markets. But when he had knelt beside her chair and presented the ring, speaking in a voice that carried emotion rarely heard by anyone outside this private space, the focus had shifted from business success to personal commitment. "I want you to be my wife," he had said, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights beyond the windows. "Not just my companion or my protected asset, but my partner in everything I build. The woman who stands beside me when I transform this organization into something our children can inherit with pride." Keiko's acceptance had been immediate and absolute, spoken with the certainty of someone who had found not just love, but purpose in a world she had never imagined joining. "Yes," she had said simply, and the word had carried the weight of a decision that would reshape both their futures. The wedding planning that followed was an exercise in controlled extravagance, a careful balance between celebrating their union and demonstrating the scope of Miho's power to anyone who might be watching. The guest list included legitimate businessmen and criminal bosses, politicians and judges, artists and academics, all brought together to witness the marriage of Seoul's most eligible crime boss to the American woman who had captured not just his attention, but his devotion. The ceremony itself was a fusion of Korean tradition and Western elegance, held in a private garden that had been transformed into something that resembled a fairy tale more than a criminal celebration. Keiko wore a custom gown that had taken months to create, a masterpiece of silk and lace that managed to be both modest and stunning, appropriate for someone about to become the wife of a man whose enemies would scrutinize every detail for signs of weakness or ostentation. When Miho spoke his vows, his voice carried across the assembled guests with the same authority that characterized his business meetings, but the words he chose were personal and vulnerable, promises that had nothing to do with criminal enterprise and everything to do with the love that had grown between two people who had saved each other from very different kinds of destruction. "I promise to protect you not just with my power, but with my heart," he said, his eyes fixed on hers with unwavering intensity. "I promise to build a world where your strength and intelligence can flourish without fear. I promise that everything I am and everything I own will serve the purpose of ensuring your happiness and our shared future." Keiko's responding vows were equally personal, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of their relationship while promising to stand beside him as he transformed his world from something built on violence into something that could be sustained by respect and legitimate success. "I promise to stand with you as you build something better than what you inherited," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I promise to be your partner in creating a legacy that honors both your strength and your capacity for change. I promise that my love for you will never waver, regardless of what challenges we face or what transformations our world requires." When the ceremony concluded with their first kiss as husband and wife, the applause that followed carried undertones of acknowledgement from Seoul's power brokers that this marriage represented a significant shift in the city's criminal landscape. Kang Miho was no longer just a crime boss. He was a man building something permanent, something that could outlast violence and intimidation, something worthy of the woman who now shared his name and his empire. The reception that followed was an exercise in sophisticated excess, a demonstration of wealth and influence that left no doubt about the scope of resources at their disposal. But beyond the expensive champagne and custom entertainment, beyond the networking between legitimate businessmen and criminal organizations, the evening was a celebration of transformation for both bride and groom. Keiko moved through the crowd of guests with the natural grace of someone who belonged in this world, conversing with senators and syndicate bosses with equal ease, demonstrating that her integration into Miho's life was complete and permanent. She was no longer the protected asset or grateful employee. She was the wife of one of Asia's most powerful men, and her presence elevated every interaction and negotiation that would follow. For Miho, watching his wife command respect from people who had known him since childhood, the evening represented validation of choices that had sometimes seemed impossible. By choosing love over pure strategic calculation, by allowing someone into his heart who could humanize him without weakening his authority, he had discovered that power shared could be more effective than power hoarded. The honeymoon was spent in private properties across 3 continents, a tour of safe houses and legitimate businesses that demonstrated the global scope of Miho's operations while allowing them to enjoy their new marriage away from the obligations of Seoul's criminal hierarchy. When they returned to South Korea 6 weeks later, they did so as a unified force that would reshape how organized crime interfaced with legitimate society. Keiko's role in their shared enterprise extended far beyond the companion duties that had characterized her original arrangement with Miho. She became involved in the strategic planning that guided his organization's evolution toward legitimate business, bringing insights about international markets and cultural dynamics that proved invaluable in negotiations with foreign partners. More importantly, her presence humanized Miho in ways that enhanced rather than compromised his authority. Rivals who might have challenged a ruthless bachelor thought twice about confronting a man whose devotion to his wife was backed by the resources to eliminate anyone who threatened her safety. Business partners who had been wary of dealing with pure criminal enterprise found it easier to negotiate with a crime boss whose American wife could facilitate cultural understanding and communication. The apartment where Keiko had once hidden from Marcus, counting tips and planning escape routes, had been demolished to make way for a luxury development that bore her name. The Keiko Williams Cultural Center would provide English language education and business training for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds, funded by profits from Miho's increasingly legitimate empire. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in Seoul's power structure. Where once had stood a building that represented fear and trapped desperation, now rose something that created opportunities and hope. The transformation of that space reflected the broader changes that Keiko's influence had brought to Miho's world. On their first wedding anniversary, As they stood together on the penthouse balcony that had become their private retreat from the demands of their public roles, Keiko reflected on the journey that had brought them from a chance meeting in an upscale restaurant to a partnership that commanded respect throughout Asia's criminal and legitimate business communities. "You're mine," Miho said quietly, his arms encircling her from behind as they watched the sun set over a city that acknowledged their authority. "Forever and completely mine." "Forever and completely yours," Keiko agreed, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "And you're mine, transformed and powerful and absolutely devoted." Below them, Seoul continued its endless pulse of commerce and ambition. But the city now operated under the protection of a love story that had redefined what was possible when power served purpose rather than ego, when strength was directed toward building something lasting rather than simply maintaining control through fear. Keiko Williams had walked into the Meridian restaurant as a frightened woman counting tips toward an impossible escape. She had emerged from that world as Keiko Kong, wife to one of Asia's most powerful men and architect of an empire that would be remembered for the lives it protected rather than the enemies it destroyed. The whole city had learned what happened when someone threatened what belonged to Kong Miho. But more importantly, they had witnessed the transformation that was possible when two people found in each other not just love, but the courage to build something better than the world they had inherited.